Well, what's up, Colliders? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about a film that makes me wish I hadn't dropped out of Taekwondo after my yellow bout as a kid. Shang-Chi, Legend of the Ten Rings, the latest entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Just hit theaters. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So I've been pretty upfront with other like the Black Widow review that I've been fairly lukewarm towards the MCU. I think most of them are good, consistently kind of high quality, but just kind of getting a little bored of the overarching big story and just kind of feeling like it's almost the same story, just a new coat of paint. There's so many movies, but this is one that looked interesting to me when the trailers came out. It looked different. And don't look now, but I think the MCU might be reeling me back in. I enjoyed Black Widow when it came out a couple months ago, and I really enjoyed this film. This is, I think is in general the kind of the latest wave of Marvel movies are at their best when they don't feel like the latest wave of Marvel movies, when they feel like they're bringing something new to the table. And Shang-Chi, Legend of the Ten Rings, it's at its heart, it's very much still a Marvel movie. It has all the hallmarks of the franchise at this point, but it's just a lot of fun. This is just it's a enjoyable movie. I think overall the story is probably not as memorable or as like consequential to the overall story as some of the other kind of more recent Marvel movies or some of the bigger ones. But it's just a ton of fun. It's just a great. It has so much going for it. I left the theater just feeling like, hey, that's what movies are for. It's just a great time. And I think the kind of the Asian influence and the almost all Asian cast definitely brings a different kind of flavor, a welcome flavor that kind of sets it apart from some of the other MCU movies. And I think also just the action. This is. Just off the top of my head, unless I'm missing a great movie back in the past, but this is probably the best action in any Marvel movie, maybe ever. It doesn't have maybe like the mind blowing of like this, Captain America Civil War, where it's all super powered superheroes and, they can just do these massive scale and combine powers. And some of that just sort of like blow your geek brain kind of moments, but just some of the action in this, very like martial arts type action it's just super clever. It's super engaging. There's always, the fight scenes never get tedious or, where you just sort of, okay, just punch, kick. They're always throwing new things at you. I think they've been kind of hyping in some of the marketing material the action scene that happens on kind of an out of control bus as they're cruising through downtown San Francisco, where I used to live. There's a reason they're pushing that scene. That is just an excellent just kind of showcase of what this movie has to do action wise. It's one of the most just kind of captivating action scenes in a movie that I've seen in quite a while. As far as the cast, this is a strong cast across the board. A lot of, at least for me, because it's an all Asian cast, maybe some actors and stuff that aren't as familiar from kind of more of a Western audience, but they're all good. They all hold their own, and it's really elevated the two main characters, Shang-Chi, called Sean in the film, and then Caddy, sort of his buddy. Their chemistry really elevates this film and kind of it gives a lot of heart to what's going on. The character of Caddy is played by Awkwafina, and I'm a big fan. She was one of the only redeeming elements in the Jumanji movies. She typically plays kind of the sidekick, the comic relief, and the sort of character that oftentimes is annoying, can kind of be grating, but just something about her as an actress, she kind of has that endearing quality that she isn't annoying, that she brings a lot of the humor, but also just a lot of the like kind of pedestrian perspective of, she's the non-hero kind of character that can kind of call out and sort of be a voice of the audience when things are just getting crazy. And I think also the villain in this movie, I don't think it's necessarily a menacing villain. It's not like a scary villain and kind of imposing in that way, but it's a nuanced villain. There's a lot. We'll get into that a little bit when I get into like some of the themes in this film. But I think because it's more of a nuanced, kind of sympathetic villain, that it does elevate him kind of beyond the fray of what typically kind of notoriously MCU just sort of having some uninspired villains. And I found he was a more captivating villain because there was more to his character than just being the baddie. So one of the things about this film is about at the halfway point, you can mark it right at the reemergence of a kind of a surprise appearance of an old MCU character that I won't spoil. But right at that appearance kind of marks a pretty drastic tonal shift. The first about half of this film is, relatively speaking for a comic book movie, is kind of more grounded and gritty and kind of real, this world realistic. And kind of at that point, it takes a sharp detour veer into sort of the fantastical and becomes way more of a kind of a silly, zany film. And to be clear, I was fine with that. I'm a fantasy guy. I actually appreciated that the film was kind of bringing that. We haven't really had an MCU film that kind of we've had some mystical stuff, but not really just like full-on fantasy and some of that material. So I was okay with it. But I do think the result of it is a somewhat uneven film where it does just sort of let loose about halfway through, and you kind of have to just accept that this is the kind of film that we're watching. It is crazy. And unfortunately, some of the more personal stuff that they'd set up in this early part of the movie does sort of devolve into a little bit more of sort of the typical, the fate of the world is at stakes, and there's a big CGI, faceless people fighting, and that was too bad. But I think overall, there's enough going for the film that it's not too big of an issue, but it did stand out to me. As far as content, kind of stuff to consider on the surface, there's not a ton of profanity. There's just a handful of kind of minor profanities. Mostly just words starting with the letter S is probably used 4 or 5 times, and that's about all I caught in that sense. Sexuality, there is none, which was beyond maybe just the main character taking off his shirt and them sort of zooming in on that. Beyond that, there's no sexuality. And violence is just typical MCU kind of superhero stuff. This characters fight, characters die, minimal blood, just kind of what we've come to expect from like an MCU style movie as far as violence. So nothing gratuitous or concerning in that area. As far as beneath the surface kind of themes, it's in one way, despite like the film tonally being somewhat inconsistent and kind of balancing kind of 2 different, almost distinct tones throughout the film at the midway point. I think for me, one of the great strengths of this movie is that it is consistent thematically. It really, and there might be some other kind of more minor themes sprinkled throughout, but for the most part, this film really just hammers in on one main theme, and because of that, because it's sort of more narrowed focus, it's able to develop it in some interesting ways. And for me, the theme in this movie that kind of drives it forward is kind of identity and how sins and mistakes and guilt and tragedy in our past informs our current identity for better or worse. And it shows that the film kind of plays that out and through looking at how different characters respond, sort of the family, Sean, the main character, then his sister, and then his father, who's also the villain in this film. They all kind of have a shared history of sort of some tragedy and some stuff that happened in their upbringing and some loss and grief and stuff that they're working through. And the film kind of uses each of these characters to show kind of how you respond to that, whether you just sort of run away from your past and try to forget it and not face it, whether you use and you try and combat it and it sort of drives you to be better and to overcome, or whether it sort of can control you and kind of lead you down, kind of define who you are in the case of the villain. And one of the effective ways that the film kind of wrestles with this theme is that it's probably the least linear of any of the Marvel movies. There's often kind of frequent uses of flashback throughout the film. It's not just like one flashback that tells the whole backstory, but kind of throughout the film, they're sprinkling in these flashbacks to kind of Sean growing up and sort of their family and what happened, and kind of revealing just bits and pieces more to the puzzle, and kind of using those flashbacks to inform and provide kind of context to the struggles that they're facing in the present. And there's some surprising stuff that comes out in those flashbacks. And I thought it becomes an effective way to sort of to show through these characters how, hey, you know, what happened in the past, you can't run from it. So how do you overcome that and kind of face it head on and not let it define you? And as the film goes on, the application does become more kind of supernatural and cosmic. And I think some of the application kind of goes from just sort of the personal, you know, we got to overcome, you know, cat inspirational poster on the wall. And there's, I think the creature called the Dweller in the Darkness, sort of this mythical evil creature that really becomes kind of a stand-in for like a Satan-esque character. It's sort of present throughout the film through just whispers and deceit and lies and kind of preying on Sean's father's kind of guilt of his past and kind of reaching him and kind of manipulating him in his moment of weakness. And I think because of that, it makes Sean's father, like the main kind of antagonist throughout the film, it makes him a way more interesting character because it makes him. This is not just him. He's a sort of an evil guy, and he wants to watch the world burn. But he's a broken person. That it does show that he wants to overcome sort of his past and his selfishness and his violence, and that he's able to a certain point to do so. But just kind of as you know, he begins listening to these wrong whispers and voices, and you know, unable to just overcome his grief, that he kind of acts out of his brokenness rather than just sort of wanting to bring the world down. And I think because he is like a sympathetic character, it makes Shang-Chi's kind of the main character, it makes his journey just more relatable, because it's not just kind of him needing to overcome, you know, I need to choose the path of goodness instead of the evil path my heritage, which is a theme that's been played out in countless films. But it's kind of instead of that, it's more just contrast him with his father, and I need to face this sin and this guilt and kind of not let it define me in the same way that it defined my father. Not that it's just good or evil, but it's just sort of how do we find that identity? And ultimately, you know, kind of the way the film unpacks that is in a more kind of postmodern, spiritual, you know, you just need to look within you and find out who you really are. And obviously that's kind of more in line with kind of more new agey worldview. But I think just kind of in a general sense, the idea of sort of brokenness and sin and kind of confronting that and not letting it define us. A lot of those themes can definitely be affirmed by Christian viewers just as much. So overall, I really enjoyed this film. I thought it was this is one of my favorite Marvel movies I've seen in quite a long time. It felt different, it felt fresh, and most of all, it just felt fun. There's a lot of humor, there's a lot of cool action. I don't know if it's necessarily a film that just has a bunch of moments that you want to just watch again and again and going to be one of those super popular, you know, kind of MCU movies like maybe, you know, some of the Avengers movies or Captain America movies are. But as far as this kind of spending 2 hours in a theater, this film kind of hit the mark for me. And I think maybe, you know, if this is sort of the direction the MCU is going, then it might be time for me to punch my ticket again, jump back on the bandwagon. I know the Eternals trailer that played before this film looks awesome too. So definitely seems like the MCU is moving into a little bit more kind of innovative, kind of fresh ground. And this is a sort of a sign that they're on the right track. But if you saw this movie, I'd love to talk about it. I'm not familiar with the source material, the comics. So if you're kind of, you know, well versed in that, I'd love to hear your perspective on what you saw in this film and just what you kind of made from some of the themes, and if you kind of approached it the same or saw the same thing as I did as far as sort of sin of the past and overcoming that. I'd love to just have those conversations with you. If you haven't done so, I encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. Got a lot of stuff we're doing here. Make sure you like this video. But most of all, guys, stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.